Hi and welcome to the 25th anniversary interviews. I'm here with Eddie Brigdale. Eddie, how are you?
I'm okay, fine. Looking forward to the match tonight.
Yeah. So I understand you've been involved in ice hockey since before 1948. So how did you originally get involved in this then?
I used to live in Brighton, and Brighton, fortunately or unfortunately, as some of the people have decided, was the home of the Canadian forces in the war. And where you get Canadians and you get an ice rink, there's an obvious connotation where they come together. They invited children who incidentally was one of them, I was one, from the local schools to go along to the ice rink to see what ice hockey was all about. Nobody had the vaguest idea. So we all trooped down to the ice rink, and on the first match was played between, I can remember the first match very well, it was played between the Canadian Army and the Canadian Air Force. And what we didn't realise at the time, that we were looking at some of the finest players in the world, because they'd been called up for the Army and Air Force. At the end of the game, we all were super excited, and then they very nicely threw a lot of sticks onto the ice and some pucks, and we all piled onto the sticks and pucks, and that started it all off. The Canadian Army and Air Force were very, very good to the youngsters, and we certainly enjoyed our time. The next thing that really happened of any note was at the end of the war, a Southern League was formed. This is known in ice hockey terms as the Golden Era. But being reasonable about it, it was a very, very good era. The teams were all Canadian except for one British boy. And they were based on London and Brighton and Nottingham. The London teams were, if anybody's interested, were the Lions and Monarchs out of Wembley, the Greyhounds and the Racers out of Haringey, and Earl's Court, Streatham, and as I said, Brighton and Nottingham. What people don't realise this day and age, that transport was very, very difficult. Very, very difficult. We didn't have motorways, and the teams had to rely on trains and what we used to call charabancs, buses, coaches. But they were very, very fine era of ice hockey, but we had quite a good class of it. But like all things in ice hockey, they priced themselves out of the market. And that's the history of ice hockey in this country. People pricing themselves out of the market. And unfortunately that did happen, and the league folded. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention one particular game. It seems to be silly that we had all these games being played at that time, but there was one game stood out, and that particular game was the Tigers versus the Russians. And to put a quick little background on it, the Russians had just sprung onto Canada, gone through Canada, and they went through the Canada like a knife through butter. And they turned out that the Canadians were very, very shaken. And on the way back from Canada, they called in England, and they played a team at Wembley, which they also beat. And so they ended up at Brighton. Brighton's team, like all the other teams, only consisted of 11 players. So what they did is they borrowed a couple of players from, actually borrowed 4 players from Haringey, grafted them into the team, took on the Russians and beat them. They still talk about it in Brighton, that they beat the Russians. And it was it was an incredible game. The road from stadium in Brighton, the old SS, was uphill, and I swear that we all walked up that hill and nobody put their feet on the pavement. We were up 10 feet in the air. It was so glorious. And that is the story of that match. I say we still talk about it in Brighton now. Not so many of us left now.
So one last thing, I understand you're on the bench tonight with
Yep.
the All-Stars.
Yep.
So if you could sum up how that feels in one word, what would you say?
I think it's a heck of a privilege. I think it's an awful privilege. Over the years I've followed the Hawks from what we like to call the cracking seats day. Maybe I shouldn't mention this, but when they first opened this stadium, which incidentally was open for ice hockey, they selected the wrong seats or the wrong plastic for the seats, and one of the amusing things that used to take place, there used to be a bang every now and again as a seat exploded. There's a story going on, which incidentally is not true, that when the mayor of Blackburn came along to a game, that his seat blew up, but it didn't. That's a tale we like to people promote, but it's not in fact true. But I say the seating was quite remarkable in those first days. But it didn't really affect me, because for the first 5 years of watching ice hockey at this stadium, I always used to go onto the balcony. And over that period of time, we saw some pretty good games and some pretty awful games, quite honestly. You have to tell the truth. But the personalities were larger than life. And I'm glad to see on this match tonight some of those personalities are returning. I think it's great that they should do so.
That's great. Thank you, Eddie. I'll let you get back to sorting things out for tonight's game then. Thank you very much for taking the time out to talk to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.